I really thought I might have been able to not have any more embarrassing recordings, but okay, so I'm trying to do something which, if I could successfully do, then that would pretty much have all my ducks in a row. My work would pretty much be finished. What I'm trying to do is probably a bit too difficult to do with just myself as a single case study. I need probably at least one other person to start getting some to seeing some parallels perhaps that would otherwise not very easily stick out. But so everything I'm about to say is highly sort of is as it appears to me, just looking at my particular case, and it's horribly speculative. I'm trying to work out what the emotional tones mean. I have given outlines before that I think that essentially the emotional tones is the experience that the positive development of the false ego complex is experiencing from the superego. Um, and I mean, that is a starting outline. There's nothing wrong with that. That's still probably roughly going to be correct in the end. As I try to, because, the emotional tones were an empirically observed feature. Uh, the only thing that I don't understand about the emotional tones, which I can't retrace and reverse engineer the theoretical basis of, is their particular order which each subset of sattva, rajas, and tamas has their own particular ordering of these things. And I think that there is something more significant above the ordering, which I can't really get into unless I specifically look at other types. But just for clerical reasons, I don't have the resources to just look at some other types. I'm just looking at my own. So as I said, there might be better patterns, but that would call out to me if I contrasted more than one type, especially types from another guna, another subset or subspecies. To see if there are any interesting, consistent patterns that hold true within a particular subset. Because I mean, this is in exploration of the things that I've already spoken about. Some of these things sound a bit awkward to say, but how sattva is always regarded within the Hindu Vedic texts to be superior to the other subtypes. They are a better caliber of personality, and I think that well, I'm going to speculate as to why I believe that is just looking at my type. If I have correctly associated my type to be sattva, where I did originally believe that my type was rajas, I anyway, that could be a form of special pleading, and that might be something that might be have to be reversed. Maybe I'm a rajasic type. Maybe I'm not a sattva type. Doesn't really matter that much. It just matters what is the structural distinction. What is the structural difference? Now, when I look at my type through the lens of the emotional tone, certain features on the metatype architecture get get brought into prominence. And so what's interesting is that the start of my type, the weird thing about my type is that it's a double circuit. So there are lots of double-barreled, so where other people would just have three emotional tones, which then get recycled once each. So then they have six, but they only have a base of three. My base is five because it's double-barreled, and single. So whereas other types would only have three emotional tones, Mine has 5. Now, so my very first emotional tone in the particular sequence for the subset starts off in the vanity, and it correlates to the unconscious side of the mind with an absent ego. So the very first step in the chain starts off in the unconscious side of my mind, and it negates the ego property of the vanity. Then that leads on into this, because this is a double-barreled one. It leads on into the same two functions, the unconscious and the ego, but now the ego is no longer negated; it is exemplified. So it's kind of like wait, I just said completely the wrong thing. I misread that. That actually happens later on. The second thing, yeah, so the first thing is correct, and then the double barrel of the first thing goes backwards in some sense. It doesn't go forward; it goes backwards into the child function or the lust, and it connects with the unconscious lust, and in some sense, it negates the subconscious vanity. That unconscious lust uh, is functioning in the absence of the subconscious vanity, which is it's almost like a strange juxtaposition, because that's almost like one step back. So it's interesting that the first foot in my type is in the vanity, and the second footing, in some sense, negates the subconscious vanity, and it takes one step backwards into the lust. So it first has a look at the vanity, and negates the ego, the ego's, and then it takes one step backwards into the lust. And then the next step is also another double-barreled one. It goes back to the vanity, and then it sort of accentuates the ego. It's the same. It uses the same base as the unconscious. So it's the unconscious vanity plus the ego's vanity, but it really accentuates the ego's vanity. It exacerbates it, and then the second step, because this is a double-barreled one, goes into the parent function. And the parent function is primarily made up of the ego's parent in the absence of the subconscious parent. So the subconscious parent gets left out, gets slighted, as it were, or it gets... Now, I'm not exactly sure how to interpret all these things within the architecture of metatype. Is that what's going on is perhaps like when something is happening in the absence of something else. In some sense, that the absence of that thing might still be very well represented. So in some sense, because it's an internal repression. So you have to repress your own architecture, and then that's sort of going to create a compensatory sort of tension that is going to be latent within the functioning of the base of that emotional tone. And it could also be that, because I mean, I don't really know how to think about these emotional tones. Like, it might be that they exist within a context. Like, I mean, I can't find where to ground them. I can't find where to anchor them. I don't know if essentially maybe all these emotional tones could all be seen as the three parent functions of the positive developed side of the mind, and the three inferior functions as being the sunset. So it's like that maybe these are being these emotional tones are being emulated by the parent functions. I mean, that's just a complete guess. I don't, or it's the emotional tones are happening themselves, or I mean, in my original theory, um, because I knew that this. I remember when I came up with this order that I didn't have the resources to explain it. I didn't like it wasn't a hunch. It was something that I was deriving, but I didn't have any data to correlate it to. And I um, knew that I was evaluating something, I was monitoring something that that was sort of slightly beyond the vista of that epoch of development that I was working on. Um, and I knew that there would be trouble finding where to root it and where to anchor it. And I knew that one of the confusing things is that, like, I mean, first of all, I didn't have the metatype architecture, but I envisioned something like the metatype architecture, and I knew that essentially that the reason why there was this very strange kind of ordering was because things were being used more than once. That there was like a partial internal reflection of certain things, which is why there is an asymmetry built into the sequencing of the different subsets of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So anyway, and and I thought that it might have been a cop out, and I even when I made this model, I made it vague, but essentially how I made the ordering, the model of the ordering of these emotional tones within the subspecies, um, was I just invented new jargon, and I called them each, so they each had a position, but I also knew, you know, that it might also be essentially wrong to equate the worship declaration and answer in sattva to a worship declaration and answer within tamas or rajas. Um, that they might be quite differently constituted. Anyway, okay, so that aside, I didn't mention the third. Okay, and then the last emotional tone is also just to do with the parent function, and it is the ego and the subconscious. So again, it goes back on the last thing, is that it's an interesting pattern as well, that whenever, actually no, never mind, it's not true in terms of the so it goes from worried to cautious to annoyed to confused to angry. And I don't know where to. So I mean, this overlay onto my metatype architecture. The weirdest thing is that I don't know how to think about the ordering, because I can't find what is doing the ordering. Because you go from 1 to 2 to 3, and then 3 is the same as step 4, and step 5 is the same as step 2, and step 6 is the same as step 1, and then what happens then? Does it go from 6 to 1? I don't even know if it restarts it like that, or if this sequence is not is not exactly a it's just a chain of focus that 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 doesn't have to be followed, uh, but it has a natural sequential sort of latent interconnecting. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking, are these the crib notes of one's personality style? Are these like the kind of, are these the basic stepping stones that kind of take you, in some sense, I'm wondering if these emotional tones are like the lullaby that the superego is singing to the positive development of the false ego complex. And so when the false ego complex is stuck and it can't take responsibility and develop an internal locus of control, then it relies on these stepping stones just so that it can get a full cycle, just so that it can kind of and so that essentially that these stepping stones will be the prominent scaffolding of a person's false ego complex, that they will be the kind of the more rigid cornerstones of the structure. That it's not that this isn't that essentially from the superego's point of view, these are the aspects which the positive false ego complex, the positive components of the false ego complex, positive in line with the metaphor that the superego is the negative, and then the positive development of that negative picture, that that you get a positive development of the negative instruction, essentially, using the metaphor of developing a piece of film into a positive image. That the scaffolding and the positive image are these components, and then from the scaffolding the rest of the structures, let's say, emerge. And so you can go beyond these structures, but these structures have a kind of primordial beckoning to them. They have a kind of and also in people that are less developed, they would be almost animalistically prone to being, let's say, not only overdeveloped but also protected by the rest of the structures. That essentially the rest of the structures are sort of chaff to be tuned up and consumed in sort of in maintaining. I mean, I guess depending on maybe there are different species of and this is why perhaps there is such a unique array and spectrum of people, because essentially how you develop the other parts of your false ego complex around the scaffolding, and how much, let's say, internal locus of control is burdened, how much sophisticated synergy is undertaken holistically to kind of temper the initial impetus, which is um, funneled into the kind of, from the superego's point of view, from the whole point of the false ego complex, is to kind of is to follow this lullaby, um, is to dance to this tune. Um, I wonder if other types, perhaps the difference between sattva, raja, and tamas is that maybe different sides of the mind are emphasized. I mean, it might be that maybe sattva is the best because it has such a great emphasis over the parent function and the vanity. And the parent function and the vanity are the most unique parts of the mind because they are not replicated. The inferior function is replicated as the death, and the sin is replicated as the child function. So essentially, the child function, and then this is something that is slightly speculative, but when I look at my type, it's very interesting to me that the only aspect of my type which involves the child function negates the vanity. And in my sense, that means that it would be easier for me to locate that child function and to also see how it is also the subconscious sin. That the unconscious lust is the subconscious sin. Those are the same things. But that, I wonder if that's easier for me to know that because the emotional tone that is touching that unconscious lust is negating my vanity, is negating my subconscious vanity, which allows me to see it not only as the unconscious lust, but to also see it as the subconscious sin. And so maybe that might be a common characteristic within sattva, is that maybe all the sattva people realize that their lust is also a sin, and they see it has this dual facet to it. That the sin of the subconscious has been repurposed as the unconscious lust, and therefore the child function of the unconscious. And so essentially, because sattva, I mean, maybe this is not a common feature in sattva. Maybe the common feature in sattva is, as I said before, is that the focus is between the parent function and the vanity, and the parent function and the vanity are in a privileged position. But I mean, the vanity is also very. And you would think just from an MBTI standpoint, because I link the vanity. The vanity is the hero function. The vanity is the dominant function. But I mean, everyone generally is regarded as having a strong dominant function. That's why it's called the dominant function, and the parent function is also very important. So, but yeah, I haven't looked at other people's metatypes overlaying the emotional tones because it would. I mean, maybe tamas has their emotional tones related to their inferior function. If that is the case, then you could understand why ignorance would be associated with that subtype because the inferior function is also the death, and so it's used twice. So it's going to be so much more convoluted. It's going to be so much more murky because everything is going to have a double facet to it. It's going to sort of get out of control. And I must say, not even sattva types don't have double barrel. Not all sattva types have a double circuit. And it just so happens that my double circuit type gives me perhaps that aspect of being able to see that my lust function is also the subconscious sin, which kind of already gives you some sort of structural insight as to the self, the what this game is in terms of it already gives you some sort of implicit insight into the false ego complex, I would say, or at least specifically for my type. And then the interesting thing about my type is that because it has these double-barreled thing, that I'm first worried and then I'm annoyed, and then what's the other one? or no, it's actually I'm first cautious and then I'm first worried and then I'm cautious and then I'm annoyed and then I'm confused and then finally I'm angry. But yeah, I still haven't fully integrated this into my understanding of how to describe bipolar. Because it's not both of them. Because you see, like, let me look it up quickly. It's the it's. Let me just double check. I think it's the blue one. I think it's the oath and the worship that is the root of the two personalities, or at least the potential for. Okay, yeah. So it is the emergent. Yeah, it's the worship and the oath. Okay, so the worship and the oath is. What about it? That's the alternative one. So it's not necessary that. So the worried and the cautious are the two differences, and it's the beginning. For sattva, it's the beginning of the sequence. So yeah, so essentially, I have a worried variant and I have a cautious variant, and I always, when I talked about myself sort of esoterically, I said, oh well, the one is the generalist circuit and the other one is the particularist circuit. See what's the difference is that, and also the one is rooted in the child function, the other one is rooted in the vanity, and the worried one starts off first. So that's, I don't even know which one I would label the particularist and which one I would label the generalist, but oh well, I mean the one is ego. Oh, sorry, the one is vanity driven. The other one is lust driven, and the lust uses Ni-12 reason and or liberty. One is called liberty, and the other one is faith. Is unconscious driven. They're both unconscious, and that is called faith. So I mean, the faith one must be the generalist one, I would think, and liberty must be the. No, that's not even necessarily true, perhaps. But also the one is the negation of SE17. It's the negation of the ego function. How things are. Yeah, that does sound. So faith does sound like the generalist one. But the liberty negates TI9 from the subconscious. Which is interesting because that could also be seen to maybe subvert the generalist one. Interesting. The other loose theory that I had was that this six ordering, the the ordering of the worship, the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the devotion, and the oath was essentially the model, the 12 model itself, which there still might be something to that. I mean, that's actually how I ended up conceiving of it, just because it was the most sophisticated, probably, permutation of the model, and I just wanted to give it the most sort of elaborate expression that I could theorize at the time, but I knew that it was pretty conjecturous. But anyway, but it did also nicely fit in with the idea that is why emotional tones that's how we can communicate with each other, even though we have the false ego complex, is because we're essentially using the emotional tones themselves to propitiate each other's emotional tones. And so we have a kind of some way in which grammar is being transposed and signaled, and we have our antenna of our emotional tones is resonating and sympathizing with counter offers and things like that, and that's all already independently sort of theorized in terms of how the feng shui of emotional tones, which I'm not going to talk about, but that feeds into that kind of model. But that's not really that satisfactory for wanting to find how this can be anchored within metatype architecture. Um, there could be a quasi cross-pollinated model that I might be able to sort of devise, but I don't want to do that, because I think that would just be inventing my way out of this problem. And it would be so nice to find something uh, solid to sort of hang this on. So anyway, if we ignore all the absent elements and we just look at all the positive ones, we see that in my type, the most important functions are NI12 unconscious child function, NI13 unconscious vanity, and then again NI13 plus SE17 vanity. That SE vanity is actually very important. As appraisal. Okay, and then it's FE1 ego, and then it's FE1 ego for the parent function, and TE10 subconscious. So just writing out those functions, I mean, could be, I didn't name all the negative ones, negative TI9 subconscious. The negative ones are also, I think, also are quite prominent. And it's because it's describing cautiousness. You see, when I'm looking at this, I'm also at the same time, with half my mind, thinking of revising some of the emotional tone stuff, because I always knew that I didn't really know what I was talking about when for example, my definition of cautious is experiencing a grasp of why things are a particular way, distinguished by an absent grasp of why those things will be that particular way. Now, in some sense, when you have an absent TI9, an absent grasp of why things will be that way, in some sense, it might not be a global absence. It might be the particular absence in relation to your use of the base of that emotional tone. But it might also have a general awareness of that. It might be a more naive use, of the absent function, which is made to work everywhere but the domain of the base. It's almost it can sound a bit like cognitive dissonance, but I think it's more sophisticated than that. Because I think that it might, again, like, I have to speculate about this, I have to theorize about this, because now I'm actually at the point at which I can actually introspect or self-evaluate. But essentially, when I'm being cautious, because now that I've got the metatype architecture to look at, it might actually be that what I was describing as an absent use of this cognitive function, it might actually be that it is a naive use of that function in the absence of the base, in the absence of the domain of the base. So it might be an occluded use of the function. This, again, might also be important for therapy as well, perhaps. That might be one way to dissolve the scaffolding of the false ego complex, or at least how it subsists in the positive side. So often I get excited because I really see that what I'm describing so perfectly describes what's going on inside of people, or at least what's going on inside of myself. And then I kind of lose that excitement because I realize that from all this insight, I can see what I'm doing inside of myself, but it's still not really possible to find the linchpin to make it stop. I was even thinking, I often talk about how, oh yes, this thing is probably the key to solving it. And then I end up always moving back into the position, well, actually, now this thing that I haven't been focusing on, now suddenly that becomes prominent. It moves the linchpin to a new area. And I was even thinking recently, well, actually, the real problem is not any of this stuff that I've been looking at, it's the death. Really, if you can just stop living under the death, under the conditionality of the death, then the whole thing will be will be exhausted. That essentially the death is the only thing that you really have to overcome. It's the start of the chain. It's the implicit thing at the beginning, but then obviously in some sense the death never happens. You observe it as happening. You it's a fiction that you make real by engaging in the first judgment in the chain, which is the lust, and then once you sort of are in the aftermath of the lust, then you're already sort of caught up in a cycle that infernally has no end. But it might be that the emotional tone, that maybe all that, knowing how those mechanisms work, are might be important for therapy. It might be for a kind of mastery of being able to control one's thoughts, or at least be able to know what they are. But then essentially the actual magic in actually discharging the false ego complex will come from the particular hidden treasure that is hidden under some of these prominent scaffolded, which are really the kind of the core ontological um, cornerstones. But yeah, it's interesting. That then you might be able to find the particular the particular piece of the puzzle to try to rehabilitate, and then everything else might discharge proceeding from that. It really might just be the sort of the step one of the emotional tone, which for me is worried and cautious, but uh, maybe I have to worry about each of them independently. Wow, I think that would actually be quite useful. Just looking at these two negative occluded functions, I think uh, there is a lot of sort of treasure trove under that. And seemingly that's the start of the chain. So if I can kind of rehabilitate those dimensions, it might just kind of cut off the whole sequence of cascading uh, entanglement. Maybe all the occluded functions might be good to do, not just in the first sense, perhaps. Anyway, I have to think about it. Still, I mean, maybe these things are just complicated and they can't be rooted in something very, very simple. It would have been nice to find them. I mean, in some sense, I mean, I should be grateful that I have actually found anywhere where metagram can be married to metatype, because I mean, it might have been that there was no connection between the emotional tones, and that would have been very. I mean, being able to see the connections of the emotional tones with the metatype architecture. I mean, that is something that is a is an uncanny correspondence and correlation, which I mean, I'll take that as huge positive verification. It would have been nice, perhaps, to I mean, in its in its slight awkwardness, it tells its own story. From that awkwardness, you can maybe draw conclusions from. That's just why I would like to have more different people and types, and maybe some clinical insights, so I could contrast and compare and juxtapose, because I might be able to come up with some interesting patterns uh, about the variance within different personality styles, within the different subspecies that my models inculcate. But anyway, yeah. The sad thing is, I don't know to the extent to which. I mean, this yeah, I guess it's still early days, but this is certainly very significant. So I'm still very pleased, I guess. I guess what's annoying me is that I don't have a very clear theoretical basis for even the order. What does the order mean, other than it is an argument? I mean, what's interesting is that, for example, my correlation between metatype and metagram is an elemental signature. The emotional tones can be decomposed into um, elemental bits, almost like alchemical elements. And based on that, you can read a certain signature, and then you can group different metagram types as having the same elemental signature. And then there are 17 elemental signatures. Um, and I remember at the point at which that I did that, I knew also that I could derive which metagram types are correlated to which metatypes, but that I didn't do that because I wanted to empirically confirm the correlation there. But now I've rediscovered that because of the metatype architecture corresponding to metagram, I'll be able to use that as a confirmation that certain sets of metagram are correlated to certain metatypes. Um, so yeah, that has come full circle. So that's quite positive anyway. Yeah, I guess I'll think about it some more. Okay, this is an addendum, but it's also a bit of a standalone conjecture, and it's kind of like an ode to how I need to anchor these things deeper into metatype architecture, specifically how I need to anchor metagram emotional tone circuits into metatype architecture. And all this conjecture might be for naught because it just might not be there in some sense. Um, because in some sense, maybe emotional tones can only be impeded by other emotional tones, and therefore um, they can kind of get interfered with by other people's emotional tones uh, in yeah, I can't get around there being some kind of subject object, that there has to be an object that this is applied to, that is going to allow for communication, is going to allow for some kind of transposition um, between at least agents that contend emotional tones, or at least are subjected to them internally. Um, and I can't help think that there must be some kind of metatype architecture which would also sort of, might not be a perfect correlation, but would sort of give you an idea as to what the kind of object that is being fought over, and then is having these emotional tones projected onto that object, and then having interference from other people's emotional tones that's crowding out the same object or something like that. Um, there's also something weird about the sequence of in the emotional tones or the particular circuit of a type. I still haven't been able to work out what is the significance of the first position, and then it always comes back from the first. Or actually, I would have to have a look at the other subspecies. That maybe it's only sattva that comes back to itself. I mean, sattva has this sequence which is almost very sequitur, and then it's like a wave. It goes up and then it goes down, and it recedes in the way that it proceeded. So it's sort of, but they might all be like that, or there actually some might sort of seem lopsided in some sense. Okay, so that's a bit stupid that I haven't looked at that to get some greater bearing, because that would also perhaps give me some more clues as to the significance of the sequence. But it is weird that there are 6 emotional tones, and then there are 6, let's say, slots within the false ego complex: the death, the lust, the vanity, the enticed lust, the trial, and the sin. And the trial and the sin are repurposed as some other sides of the mind, death and lust. And I wonder, I mean, there might be some things that are, because it is true that some emotion, like, for example, all the double circuits, the only facet that gets double barreled in any type of double circuit is only 2 places: the emergent response, which is the worship and the oath, and the stimulus, which is the devotion and the declaration. It's the only thing that is ever singular is what I call, can't even remember what I call it, but it's the answer in the prayer. It's the one that I usually give green to or whatever, and I always associated that with, I mean, because I put colors on these. That the emergent response, the worship and the oath is blue, and I always thought that maybe that's more sort of more tamasic in some sense, and the green is sort of to do with the heart, and the red is to do with the gut. And I always thought that maybe the 12 model is where these things can be said that they're kind of relating to each other through the 12 model, which is why you have impingement from other sources of emotional tones, because they're all acting on that model of reality, as it were, which has which is linked to almost, it has the kind of the same undergirding epistemology that the emotional tones have themselves, which is located in having a super ego, which is like an avatar of the god of the world, which is like having an external locus of control. And there might be a variant of that which is inescapable, because even the non-pathological functioning of the 17 model requires you to translate lower dimensions into the flesh so that the operation on the higher dimensions can operate. Because things need to be completed in the lower dimensions in order for the higher dimensions to have a footholding, in order to perform their function, or to anyway. So going back, the emotional tone, the 6. Yeah, so I mean, when I call something the oath or the worship. I was literally making up those terms because I knew that they they meant more than one thing in more than in at least two models. That essentially they had probably a position or they had a role in two different models, and so I had to kind of converge them and make sort of these archetypes, but also knowing that I didn't have at least one of those models yet. Um, and so it might be that the two models are the 12 model and something to do with the architecture in Metatype. That was what my feeling about it was. And then it was sort of more complicated than that because I somewhat knew that in Metatype things were being used more than once, and that kind of convoluted things because the one, like in the same way that the sin of the unconscious is the lust of the ego. Um, and so I would really firmly believe, and this is a bit embarrassing because I could have sort of done this if I had my ducks in a row and I had all my materials that I need to prepare in order to make this kind of contrast. But I would say that there are unique, let's say, features between the subspecies, between sattva, rajas, and tamas. And I mean, I wonder, I mean, maybe I'm rajas, maybe I believe I'm sattva, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It just changes the label of a whole 1/3 of them. But whatever I am, maybe I am uniquely, my type is perhaps uniquely, I mean, it might be that maybe I'm rajas, but I'm sort of uniquely blessed because my personality style shows me something about um, the sin and the lust, just because of how the emotional tones um, in their internal composition sort of places the sin and the lust in a double-barreled facet out on its own. Um, which allows one of my emotional tones to sit in the vanity and the other emotional tone to sit in the lust, which is also the sin. And because it's isolated, because it actually sort of has a repulsive force against the vanity, because it excludes the vanity, or it has a naive use of the vanity outside of that particular use in the sin and the lust, it gives me a kind of um, implicit or passive insight into knowing that at least for certain that this lust is being repurposed from another side of the mind's sin. And so I can really feel because when it's being used as the child function or the lust on in terms of my emotional tone making use of it, um, it's not integrated into the vanity. It's abrasive to the vanity. Um, and so that gives me a sort of a very clear, it gives me a kind of a complexity or an internal antagonism that I'm tracking in my mind, which lets me know that essentially there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, as it were. Um, it's like a huge existential clue, because essentially, perhaps latently, I have one emotional tone that is kind of like a free agent between two sides of the mind. Um, and so it kind of shades the whole, um, and it shades the whole circuitry that I have in a kind of existential doubt, in a kind of cynical, it's kind of reticent about, because I mean this happens right near the beginning of the sequence. Um, so I have this kind of inbuilt reticence about my whole circuitry, um, right near the ground floor, and I mean, and anyway, these kinds of insights, these kinds of things that I'm talking about now, these might be the actual, where the treasure of of clinical therapeutic, if this is ever going to be treated at some point, if this is ever going to become part of a psychological practice, um, this kind of analysis might be the kind of the crux of what actually cracks cases. Is knowing these kinds of idiosyncratic sort of that are particular to the metagram type. Um, Not even to the metatype, but obviously metagram within the context of metatype. But and so this might also be what I've been talking about when I've been trying to talk about this issue, because I mean, whatever you want to call it, obviously perhaps what I'm labeling it is a bit insulting when I say natural supremacy or natural hierarchy or something like that. That some types just seem to be better than others. They seem to be more put together. Oh, I should say as well that the thing that I was just talking about, the thing that's right at the start of my circuitry, that is perhaps reticent about my whole circuitry, the thing that does that is introverted intuition NI 12, which is pure reason in some sense, or I call it also liberty, why things are some way. So again, and this perhaps also perhaps humanizes what is actually underneath all these models, that that emotional tone, I believe it's cautious. Uh, so that cautiousness just so happens to have one foot in two sides of the mind. I might be speaking out of turn. I should maybe double check this, but I believe it goes worried and then cautious. It's first worry and then it's cautious. And I have to put an asterisk after everything that I say, because it might be the case that the emergent response, specifically the oath and the worship, that the two emotional tones that I have for them might be divided. It might not be double barreled, it might be divided. That either one goes with the oath and one goes with the worship. Because when I was extrapolating all the metagram types, um, I know that the emergent response tone has a different characteristic to the stimulus. So when the stimulus has two emotional tones, there are even two versions of the stimulus having two emotional tones. There's double barreled and then there's alternative or, one or the other. But they're different. They're two species of double circuit in that sense, in terms of the stimulus. But in terms of the emergent response, they're only in the alternate. They're only or. Um, No, it actually, or they're only and. They're one. They're either one or the other. I need to check my notes, but that's interesting that there's an asymmetry there. That the stimulus has two variants in its double barrel in its double circuitry, but the emergent response, they're all the same. If it has two items there, they're all the same, and that is a bit interesting and strange in itself. Okay, what else can I speculate about? Yeah, so I mean, some of these ambiguities are certainly embarrassing and they are certainly annoying to me, but sadly, these are things that can only be worked out after I have sort of wider. I need more than just my own case, as it were. But okay, so again, the biggest problem that I have is wanting to anchor these emotional tones into metatype. You see, if I did link, I mean, they could, in some sense, you could just kind of. I was even thinking that you could embed them into the 17 model, and that might end up being the most responsible way of doing it, because that would kind of give you a kind of objective criteria, that then would also give you dynamics in terms of how that would relate to other people doing it through the 17 dimensions. Like, but that might also be incredibly convoluted. It might also just be completely the wrong idea. But I was always open to the idea of trying to use the 17 model also to just kind of ground my understanding of the false ego complex. Because, if you just take the first dimension to symbolize the death, the second dimension to symbolize the lust, the third dimension to symbolize the vanity, the fourth dimension to symbolize the enticed lust, the fifth dimension to symbolize the trial, and the sixth dimension to symbolize the sin. And then I guess you kind of probably want a seventh, or the seventh would somehow be the 17th, because it would be under the first one, would be the false prophet. Um, and that would sort of redirect the fourth dimension to become another false prophet, and then the fifth and the sixth would be repurposed as the death and the lust of a new side of the mind. Well, let's see if that were true. If the fourth dimension, because I mean, if we're taking it from the perspective of being within the false ego complex, then you would want to essentially know what everything looks like relative to the subconscious, since that's the first positive side of the false ego complex. So then the fourth dimension would be the false prophet, the fifth dimension would be the death, the sixth dimension would be the lust, the seventh dimension would be the vanity, the eighth dimension would be the enticed lust, the ninth dimension would be the trial, and the 10th dimension would be the sin. So it would go from 4 to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that would be 7 things. From 4 to 10. But the missing one, or I mean, you wouldn't really use the 7th one other than just it kind of being the background or something like that, or the kind of the environmental sort of joker or something like that. But so you would really start at the 5th dimension. So then the 5th dimension, and then I wouldn't even know how to order them within my roles that I have already given. I mean, maybe they would take on different roles. So I mean, like, could you really just say that the 5th dimension is the damn, I can't even remember what my sequence is for my type, but I think it starts off with, it's either the worship or the oath, and then it's one of the stimulus ones, and then it's one of the emergent response ones is the first one of the stimulus ones is the second one, and the third one is the I think I called it the primary counter offer, the green one, the answer, the prayer, and then for my one, it goes backwards like that. So, but I mean, people that have different subtypes have a different ordering. They start at a different place. So why? I mean, so wait, so you kind of create an archetype, an abstract, objective archetype of a sort of positive blueprint. I wonder if maybe all these things. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, this has been a bit of a crazy conjecture, but that gives me an idea. Maybe it's the subconscious. Maybe the 6 emotional tones are the digestion of the subconscious by the rest of by the culminated positive side of the mind. So obviously, ontologically, I think the subconscious is the first to get its architecture sort of positively developed. The foundations get laid for it. First you have to dig the trenches before you pour the cement. And so yeah, it could just be something like if the subconscious can be accurate. I mean, this is conjecture at this point, but if the subconscious could be accurately depicted as being, let's say, the primal legitimate source of the positive seat of consciousness, or the positive seat of an internal locus of control, in some sense that the rest of the positive false ego complex is being conducted from the subconscious, that the subconscious is the first creation and interaction from the superego. In some sense, I mean, the subconscious does begin by negating the superego because it has repurposed the trial and the sin of the superego as its death and its lust, and it is also supported by the superego's parent function in being gifted that donation. So in some sense, the subconscious really is the powerhouse that has the capability of displacing the superego. But then, because it does that, it sort of inherits these latent emotional tones, perhaps, that compel it to continue to develop the rest of the positive sides and the other sides of the mind, which sadly involve the subconscious sort of having to kind of I can't think of nice words, but sort of disintegrate itself and to kind of allow itself to sort of be torn apart and assembled and digested by yet more positive sides of the mind, and that eventually brings into focus the ego, which in some sense connects back with the superego and creates a kind of existential crisis. But in some sense, the actual self, the actual I, is resident within the subconscious, and it needs to have something of that, perhaps. So in some sense, it could be seen as the thing that is doing the other sides of the mind. That it has to, in some sense, it is the source of its prime. I don't want to just say legitimacy, but I'm saying like that is authentically what you are at its core. You are the subconscious. In terms of the false ego complex, the most real part of the false ego complex is the subconscious. So it might be that now again, it's sort of strange, is that like, well, then why would some people have different internal sequences? Wouldn't it always go in the same sequence of death, lust, vanity, enticed lust, trial, sin? So if it's doing that, if it's jumping around, I mean, first of all, this doesn't help me. I mean, to overcome how to anchor it, because I would be anchoring it completely blind. I would have to guess which is which, although perhaps actually it could be retraced. I could try to track it within my own mind. So this might be a theory that I might be able to find some working models of it at least. But essentially, which one is the death? The is the death the you know the interesting thing is that maybe they work in pairs. That essentially maybe the death and the lust will be the emergent response. So one of them will be because that is the one nice thing, is that at least naturally they have three groupings: the emergent response, the primary counter offer, and the stimulus. Each have two items in them, and I would know which is which because one is a I remade up jargon for this, but I said like one is the theme and one is the presentment, and that's another way of saying one is the perception, the other one is the judgment. In the same way that, um, I invented some sort of basic jargon that the death is a perception, the lust is a judgment, the vanity is a perception, the enticed lust is a judgment, and the trial is a perception, and the sin is a judgment. But anyway, and that corresponds to the presentment and the theme, which was essentially just jargon I made up for the six component parts. Anyway, of the stimulus, primary counter offer, and emergent response. So that would maybe give me some clues as to how to make that model. It would also somewhat be interesting because then there might be other asymmetrical features between particular types that would be underlined by that, because essentially some people's emotional tones would employ those elements in the subconscious directly, so they would have a kind of dual role, that essentially that emotional tone was hosting, or was that emotional tone was being hosted by this element in your subconscious. And what it was perhaps also doing was treating some other element in your subconscious a certain way. So there was a kind of internal repression or something like that. And so that might be another form of analysis to work out how one's own internal personality style, in a meta way, in a almost in a sort of in the sort of the metaphysics of grammar, of these ways of understanding the nuances within how consciousness functions on these different dimensions of psychological reality, how you were repressing, how you essentially had to impinge or enforce certain structural constraints, or on your own subconscious, in order just to support the weight of of uh, of your personality's sort of structure and schema. Um, Again, I think the human translation of this is something like what Scientology talks about, when you have engrams, essentially, when you have all you have done is reasoned in your head. You've made up a decision, and you've made a decision that has affected one of your faculties. And because you have uh, derogated one of the dimensions of psychological reality, you've impinged on its functioning. You have somewhat clouded the filter and the lens through which you can uh, continue to make other decisions, and so there's a kind of there's a cascade. Um, of sort of metaphysical or metacognitive byproducts, uh, which I think is roughly being, you can actually map that. You can actually track how that is happening uh, through my metatype plus metagram sort of overlay of a particular personality style. Um, and so you can see the kind of internal disintegration that is let's say a byproduct of the fact that, of a kind of a haphazard sort of situation, where, because I mean, essentially the mind is a bit of a metaphysical computer, and those metaphysics, when they are being impinged on, uh, sort of create a stable, um, pathological reality tunnel, essentially. That's going to be my sort of my vague metaphor at this point, but and at least now, uh, through my models, those things at least have a hope of being uncovered. And essentially it's that kind of nuanced analysis that would actually be a proper description of what someone's cognitive sort of biases are, or what their internal sort of cognitive dissonance would be, somewhat mechanistically described or outlined. Anyway, okay, so I mean, this is, I guess I'm trying to be hopeful. It's weird. I did actually have this idea at some point, but I didn't think to. Uh, Damn, I can't think of the word. To localize my focus into the subconscious. I didn't think of that. Um, but that really does make the most sense. It might also be wrong, but it's something that I might be able to at least. It would also give extra emphasis to the importance of the subconscious, which I think, if it's correct, will really ground a lot of the modeling into a more solid and robust. Uh, it would give a lot of context. And really start to harmonize all these models quite nicely. You see, this is the kind of breakthrough that I'm looking for. It's a bit, yeah. I know that I'm very close. So yeah, I mean, I guess I can at least start to I can look into this immediately in terms of my own type, but to actually get some proper perspective, I need to find another person that has a different species, subspecies of metagram type, and to look at their what's going on with them, just to, in some sense, that'll just help me refine some of the ways in which I'm describing what's going on with my own type, and then I'll have a solid model to then try to kind of explode and to see how well that sort of matches with being able to describe other people's psychology, and perhaps then also discover new insights just from some kind of, from that stable point, then finding nuanced contradistinctions that also might give new insight into how certain aspects can be interpreted. But I think, I mean, I'm really getting ahead of myself, but I mean, this is if I can ground it into metatype. This is why it's so important to try find a way to ground it into metatype. If I had to ground it into, I mean, I wouldn't want to, but if I had to, I mean, it would also, if this fails, I will look into the fifth dimension to the 10th dimension as a kind of, as an archetypal, as a kind of like an archetypal, um, I mean, and that wouldn't be so incorrect in some sense, because it would be essentially saying that, well, look, we all have the 17 model within us, but it's so busy being abused and doing the work of a false ego complex that it's highly contextualized, it's highly derogated, it's highly derided and impinged upon, and it's been crushed to a large extent. And so, and that might be also the description of the natural hierarchy, or the natural supremacy that I talk about, that some people's metagram and metatype architecture might just allow their subconscious, which in an objective archetypal sense spans from dimension 5 to dimension 10, um, and so is dimension 5 to dimension 10, is those six things. And some of them just have, let's say, a context that contextualizes those those, let's say, special six dimensions, which are in some sense an archetypal subconscious. And some people's circuitry will perhaps directly, because I mean, the weird thing is that if you're saying, well, that's the thing that's actually the core of that's emulating the emotional tones, then what happens if those emotional tones and the metatype architecture is dealing with those dimensions very viciously, or is impeding on them, very in a very sort of dense way, in a very condensed way, it is contracting those six dimensions. And so then you get someone who looks very aberrated, you get someone who looks very incoherent, someone who looks very sort of self-discombobulated, that their style is so I mean, but I am looking for something to confirm my, let's call it a hunch, but it's a bit more than a hunch, that there is something to speak about in the subject under the heading natural supremacy, that some personality styles have either more internal, and it might also be quite hidden. It might not, there might be some general things that you could say about Saja, Rajas, Sattva, and Tamas. There might be some very general things, and in some sense, the real distinctions might be in the combination of sort of superveiling, uh, intersecting features. This is a direct attachment to the last recording that I went over. So, I mean, it could be as well, sort of going on in the vein of thinking that these are all rooted in the subconscious, that might give a general weighting to someone's positive developed false ego complex, because then, I mean, and maybe that weighting is emphasized right at the start, because I mean, obviously there'll be some general there'll be some general thematic groupings in terms of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, because then um, it will give a weighting as to which parts of the subconscious are, it's almost like an order of preference, or it's an order of strength in some sense, because I do believe that the whole structure is going to be weighted, is going to be denser at its beginning, and that's going to set the tone and the context of everything else. And so whatever is happening in the first emotional tone, or the first and the second, is going to give you a kind of pivotal, eminent, and prominent structure that everything else has to sort of be in alignment with. And so then some people might just naturally, well, I mean, if this is true, then the general categories of the subspecies would be essentially that some people would just naturally be focused on their vanity and their, uh, or some of the subspecies are going to emphasize different slots in some sense. So, like, some people might be more defensively against their inferior function, because they're everything, because that's the start of their chain, starts in their trial or something like that. and other people might start in their vanity, and other people might start in their death. Anyway, and then tamas might be unfortunate because essentially because the sequence is always sort of mixed up. So sort of just because the start is in one place doesn't mean that the next lead on is sort of is in the same third of the side of the mind, because it's mixed up. So it's like, it might go from the trial to the enticed lust. It might go from the inferior function to the parent function, and that might just almost objectively to a bystander might seem as like a strange way of catering to your internal structure or something like that. Whereas essentially the link between the vanity and the lust, uh, and then moving, sattva might be the more sequitur styled sequence and something like that, and the other ones might be non sequitur in a particular stylistic way. Anyway, what I really, this is a bit of a tangent. What I really wanted to talk about was uh, so I mean, there will be those sort of obtuse structural differences between the subspecies, but the more nuanced sort of thing that you would be able to grasp from metagram specifically, in connection with this subconscious model of what is emulating the metagram emotional tones, is that you would be able to see, and I think that the first two are very important to setting the whole tone, or particularly even the first one. And essentially, so if you just look at the first chain in the sequence in someone's metagram type, and you look at what subconscious element is emulating that emotional tone, and then you look at the content of that emotional tone, and you then will get an idea as to which side of the mind in the positive development is preeminent, is predominant, um, and that might essentially be the natural hierarchy that I'm talking about. And when I say natural hierarchy, or natural supremacy, that's a very vague, wishy-washy. I mean, I'm trying to talk about it almost like a metaphor, because I mean, there's so many different qualities that different types seem to have. But in terms of having a natural strength and a natural weakness, and perhaps having a natural blind spot, and having so it might all be defined by sort of the idiosyncratic sort of features as to do with that beginning bit. And what it would basically tell you then is which two sides of the mind, because emotional tones are always made up of two cognitive functions. And so it would basically tell you which two sides of the mind are are in some kind of internal drama, or in some kind of major disposition in relation to one another. And it might tell you, let's say, the internal natural hierarchy in terms of which side of the mind will be privileged, um, essentially by the emotional tone itself. So it'll tell you which side of the mind is actually. Now you see, I haven't thought about how to talk about this too much, so I'm just going to say it vaguely and sort of stupidly, but that essentially, because if it is the subconscious that is doing this to itself, but the content is stored in another side of the mind, or the thing that is being emulated by the subconscious is two sides of the mind, either itself in relation to another side of the mind, and maybe the other side of the mind is being privileged, or maybe it's emulating itself attacking another side of the mind, you know, or it, and so, there are many different sort of combinations of what it could be doing, because it could be, um, what the subconscious, if it is the subconscious that's emulating the emotional tone, that emotional tone, the content of that emotional tone might be the subconscious, might be comprised of one of the constituent elements of that, might be the subconscious itself, or it might be the other two sides of the mind. It might be the unconscious and the ego. But essentially, whatever it is, that might be the most sort of crucial aspect of understanding the side of the mind. Understanding sort of the overall sort of themes that this person is prone to, because it'll tell you which sides of the mind they are actually are weighted, or actually have content and structure scaffolded onto, or like, I can't think of a good metaphor, but it would be something like that. The subconscious is the scribe, and there are 18 books that it can choose to write in, and one set of those books are have to do with the scribe's own character, and then the other sets of the books are like, is the kind of the unconsciousness of the scribe and the ego of the scribe, and the scribe can only write in two books, essentially, per role, and then each of these roles, or each of these slots, I've called, the devotion, the declaration, the oath, the worship, the answer, the prayer. So there are 6 books that take on these 6 characteristics, but obviously it's also, there'll be natural differences between whole subspecies, because sattva will always have their first book be the worship or the oath. I can't remember. It's one of the emergent responses. And one of the other ones, their first book will always be that. And so there'll be a sort of a stylistic difference in that. Well, the other one, their first book is always, the metaphor is already strained that I can't, but essentially they have different mechanical sequences of what they have, different structures to how to compile their, they have different basic formulas as to how to make their book series, and that will also give you certain obtuse differences between the different types. But I would, anyway, I still have to anchor these. But anyway, I just thought I know that what I'm saying now is sort of very weird and complex and nuanced, but I think that, well, I'm giving an overview as to, I think, how this might all hang together. Hopefully this will all be confirmed. Let's just get on with it, basically.